Welcome to Let's Not Meet. According to the Reddit, each and every single one of the stories posted here is supposedly true in some way. In fact, some of the stories we're going to be reporting on have been actually verified as true, so keep that in mind as you listen. Also, understand that we did not write these stories, and links to the actual articles are linked in the description should you want to actually listen. With that being said, sit back, relax, turn the lights down. This is 10 new horrifying Let's Not Meet stories, number 3.
I had forgotten about this incident until something randomly jogged my memory recently. Figured it was good enough to post about to my favorite subreddit. Enjoy the tale of Lisa. About 10 years ago, I got a job at a 24-hour gas station while I started college full-time. I was 18, female, and uneasy about working alone initially. But I got used to it, and the regular customers that hung around made me feel pretty safe. They stuck me on second shift usually. They could only really afford one cashier, as there was a larger, more popular station right next to us. It could get lonely sometimes too. After I had been working there a few months, I was working a particularly slow, wintry shift when the phone rang around 10:30 p.m. Favorite Mart, this is Jadaside 37. The phone very rarely rang. I expected it to be my manager.
Hi, my name's Lisa. I'm a student at the University of...
The voice was clearly a man attempting to sound like a woman. I humored her, figuring I wasn't one to judge.
I'm in a graduate program pertaining to child psychology. I was wondering if you could take part in an anonymous survey for my thesis.
This was new, but I looked around at the empty store and thought, what the hell? Sure thing, but if I have any customers, I'll have to put you on hold.
Oh, great! Now to start off, do you have any children?
Nope.
Do you have any young children in your immediate family?
2 nephews, 7 and 9.
Oh.
This was an exaggerated ooh, very breathy.
Do you ever babysit them?
Occasionally. I was still taking this seriously. Being young and naive, I saw no immediate red flags.
Do you discipline them when you watch them?
Lisa's voice was lowering now, like she was a little distracted. I put them in timeout. I was now a little wary. This turn in topic had caught my attention and I felt the need to hold back on my answers.
Do you ever spank them?
I was catching on, but part of me wanted to believe this person was telling the truth because otherwise it was a little far out. I usually leave that up to the parents.
Do they spank them hard?
I don't know.
So their parents spank them? Don't you want to spank them, though?
What?
When they're being bad little boys, don't you want to bend them over your knee and slap the shit out of them?
The voice on the other end suddenly changed to a low growl. Come on, Jadaside 37. Tell me how you spank your nephews and like it. The use of my name immediately snapped me out of it. I disgustedly threw the phone down on the receiver and immediately looked toward the giant glass door entrance to the store. Through the glare, I struggled to see if anyone might be lingering near the empty parking spot. I ran towards the doors and locked them, still scanning my surroundings. I didn't open them again until my boyfriend came to sit with me. I soon forgot about it, chalking it up to some random creeper. 2 years later, I worked for the same chain, but was now the manager of a different store. I had a cushy day shift, but one day my night shift employee had an emergency, and I found myself alone in the empty store around midnight. The phone rang. "Favorite Mart, this is Jadaside 37.
Hello again, Jadaside 37.
A voice, familiar but not quite recognizable from one sentence. "Who is this?"
Lisa, I have some questions you never answered.
Immediately, I remembered every bit of our first encounter. I ran to lock both sets of doors without hesitation. "You sick fuck, don't ever call me again." As I locked the last door, I glanced outside, and in the distance, I could see a single 4-door car parked in the shadows at a strip mall down the road. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like someone was in it, moving around. Before I hung up, I heard Lisa's male personality grunting, "You're no fun, Jadaside 37. And then I saw that car pull onto the street with its headlights off, so I ran back to the office, which had no windows and contained the security monitors. I called non-security, and a female officer said they would send a car. Then I called that same boyfriend and told him Lisa had called again. When I told him about the car I had seen, he got right out of bed and got there before the cops. I could see him arrive from the monitors, and he waited in the office with me. 30 minutes later, a cop car pulled into the lot, circled the building, and drove right back out. I decided right then and there I was closing until morning. I caught hell from the home office, but when I explained the situation, they urged me to file a report and allowed me to keep closing for night shift until my regular ex-security guard male employee could return. I left the stations a few months later after getting my CNA license. I never heard from Lisa again, but I still wonder what their true intentions were, and if they were just watching me for 2 years, as my new station wasn't far from the old one, and some of my regulars had switched when I had moved. But then again, maybe Lisa just got her kicks from calling and stalking random gas stations, and she had luckily stumbled upon me 2 years later that night. Either way, Lisa, I really hope we never meet, if we haven't already.
I'm Watching You by Jacker Co. So, basically, I was around 10 years old. I was walking home from school. It was around midwinter, and I live in Norway, so naturally, it was already dark outside. I met my older brother's friend on the way home, and he told me that he was going home from our house. So, we stopped and talked to each other for a second. That's when he left, and I started to walk again. There was a parking garage right next to me, and there was a hill which I was walking up. I was having this weird feeling like someone was watching me. So I turned around, and I saw nothing. I thought to myself that perhaps it was only my own imagination. But then I just had to check again. So I turned my head to the right, and suddenly a snowball lands directly in front of me. Honestly, it scared the living shit out of me, and I looked up to see someone standing on the garage. Now I knew that guy was the guy who threw the snowball, but I looked at him, and he looks like some sort of gang member of sorts by the way he was dressed, his posture, and the way he was looking. And he does have a movement in his hands with 2 fingers and points at his eyes, then me. Which, if you don't know, is a clear sign that means I'm watching you. My heart begins to beat at an alarming rate. Adrenaline was rushing through my veins at this point, and I started to walk faster. I turned around, and a guy jumps down from the parking garage and down into the snow, and he starts to slowly follow me. Of course, at this time, I am walking even faster, and as I speed up, he speeds up himself. I start running. He's at the edge of running at this point too. I'm fucking scared as shit. This guy is running after me. I have adrenaline pumping through my veins, and I'm thinking, what do I do now? I was not very far from my house at this point, so I thought, if I run to the house and lock the door, everything will be fine and I can get to a phone. But then suddenly the guy stops. Now, I'm already scared shitless. So, the fact that he stops does not really bother me one bit. I just kept running for my life. I crossed the street and everything is fine with me. Think to myself, okay, I'm just gonna get the heck out of here. So, I stop running, and I instead walking faster than normal. I'm out of breath at this point, so I can see my house. I think to myself, now, let me just get in my house, because holy fucking shit, I am scared. But then I hear a scream, like, as though someone was being kidnapped, or just screaming bloody murder. I turn, and I see a gang member and his gang kidnapping another child. So I was starting to question what to do. Should I, A, run to my house, lock the door, grab a phone, call the cops, or, well, do B, scream at the gang and hopefully distract them so the child could run, but take the risk of them going after me instead? Luckily, I did not have to take that choice. 2 police cars pull up and chase the gang off. To this day, I don't know if the police cars were just there in the area, or maybe they heard the scream. Or perhaps they were just passing by the scene and saw it. Or maybe someone called them. But I've learned never to walk alone in the dark. One of the members of the gang was actually arrested at that spot. So, weird, creepy Norwegian gang, let's not meet again.
At the very end of 2014, I became extremely invested in true crime and spent countless nights researching and reading all about different kinds of crimes, but mainly the Columbine school shooting of 1999. I had dabbled in the Tumblr true crime scene in the previous year for the Dzhokhar Tsarnaev case in 2013, so I ended up returning to it at this same time. The scene was subdivided into many cliques, but there was one that was extremely prevalent and consisted of the fandom's cool kids, only in real life they weren't cool at all. Instead, they sat at home, planning mall shootings, but I'll get to that later. Many of the people in that group came across as very shallow, moody, and distant, which can only be expected of people that love murderers. But there was something else. They all lacked compassion and heart, except for one boy, who we shall call Billy. Billy was nice and compassionate, but he hid it under a cold and shallow facade which could only be slowly uncovered when you began to get closer to him, which me and many other of my friends eventually did to our pleasure. This boy was one of the most beautiful things I had ever known. He was straight out of some indie coming-of-age film where the love interest is a bad boy from the wrong side of the tracks. He was just mesmerizing, no matter how fucked up he was. He was just one of those people that was hard not to love, and I don't think there was anyone in the Tumblr true crime scene that didn't love him. In February 2015, he began posting a lot of things on Tumblr about the date of Valentine's Day that year, even going as far as to create a playlist on 8 tracks about what was to happen on that date, which consisted of basically anything that sounded like trash cans being thrown against a brick wall while someone screams over it. My friends and I began to speculate. Of course, with the state of his blog, one could only assume what he had planned for that date, and many people silently caught on and reported it to the authorities. Then, the day before Valentine's Day, authorities showed up at his house and had a showdown with him, before he eventually shot himself at the scene. It was revealed that he, along with a couple of other people from the Tumblr true crime scene, had been planning a mall shooting on Valentine's Day, and could have killed literally hundreds of people. The entire Tumblr scene was in shock of what had happened, and I eventually grew out of that dark period of my life, and started to get my life back on track. Unfortunately, Billy never had the opportunity to fix himself, but on the other hand, many other people's lives were saved for the loss of one, which is a gain at the end of the day. Darkness and sadness, let's not meet again. On behalf of myself and many other friends I met along the way, may no one else ever do what Billy intended to.
There's another story written by a former mall security guard which prompted a discussion with my friends and I about how dangerous it could be for young girls to work at the mall. However, our parents thought these were great jobs to have. This is something that happened to my best friend while I was in high school. Her name was Simone. She was a few years older than me, lived next door to me my whole life. She was more like a sister, really. Our families were very close and still are to this day. Simone was 19 and working at Jean Nicole in the local mall. She was a tiny female, 5'2", and she drove a white Ford sedan. The model name is escaping me at the moment. It was a very generic-looking four-door model. Her experience really begins at the end. She's driving a couple blocks away from our house in our residential neighborhood when she's pulled over by a patrol car. When she stops, she sees the officer getting out of his car, then sees two other unmarked vehicles stop behind him, and 4 men get out and follow. As the patrol officer approaches her car, he tells her to put her hands up, open the door from the outside, and get out slowly. She complies. I know you might be thinking, fake cops, but this was on a very well-known street during the evening when the sun was still out. It wasn't an overly busy street, but busy enough to where usually a couple cars per minute would drive by. This was also the early 90s, so people were a little more clueless. They have her sit on the curb and start searching her car, while 2 of the men introduce themselves as detectives and begin grilling her. They ask her if it's her car, where she got it, her dad bought it for her, whether she loaned it to anyone, who her boyfriend was, where she worked, names of everyone she worked with, and what her relationships with them were like. As you can imagine, she is very confused and crying, begging for them to call her mom. After several hours of talking with the police at the station, here is the story she was told. The cops had been investigating a drug ring for nearly a year in the town we lived in. For 3 months, they had been tailing 2 dealers who had been using her car for transactions. They had followed her to and from work for several weeks and learned her schedule. Then, they were scheduling transactions during her work shifts when her car was parked in the mall parking lot. They were entering her car with a key each time, waiting for people to walk up or pull up alongside the car and get in for exchanges. The cops had questioned her, of course, to make sure she wasn't in on it. However, they did tell her that they were pretty sure she wasn't, and that her car was being used because it was a generic model, and there was a way to make skeleton keys which fit several cars. We were thoroughly creeped out. Drug dealers had been tailing her to and from her house, then getting in her car for months and using it, all without her noticing. She was so upset by the fact that people had been sitting in her car buying drugs, turns out it was mostly heroin and cocaine, that she quickly got rid of the car, and her parents helped her buy another one. It always bothered me because I wondered how many times they'd watched us. We lived next door to one another and were always leaving the house together. But even worse, what if she had left work early due to being sick or some emergency and walked up to her car while this was all going down? It's such a strange story, and to this day I'm still sort of in disbelief that it even happened.
Don't Follow the Mold by D.T. Malone. Abandoned buildings are amazing. And to top it all off, my mother studied historical preservation in GA, so a love of dilapidated and abandoned structures is in my blood. When you pair this interest with my love of photography, then you have a match made in heaven. And fortunately, this pairing has been seen as favorable by many of my friends. Now, as a rule, I will never enter an abandoned place myself. This has less to do with caution or fear, because as a stocky, 22-year-old bearded male, I don't often fear for my safety. But it's primarily for physical safety reasons. When a structure has been left to rot for X number of years, there's a decent chance that you could go through the floor if you're not careful. Where I live, in southwestern Ohio, there's a great many exploration opportunities to be found, especially if you take 15 minutes to cross into Indiana. In Richmond, on one of the main strips before you hit the center of the city, there is a massive hospital that has been abandoned since the early 2000s. I had known about that location for ages, as my grandfather had stayed there before its closing during his battle with lung cancer. Last year, I finally found the time and energy to drive up with my friend Luke and check it out. We got there around 2 p.m., which gave us roughly 2 or so hours before dusk would begin. For pictures, and for safety, we agreed that daylight must be a must for this expedition. Upon entering the hospital, it became immediately clear that we were far from the first people to ever visit. The entire place had been gutted, and there's graffiti everywhere. The walls were sporting, comforting phrases like, "We're watching you," and "Leave my house now." The bulk of the trip was uneventful though. We got some great shots and covered some of the primary hospital wings, steering clear of the psych wards and cancer centers. As we gradually made our way up the stairwell to each new floor, we began to notice a pattern. At each landing was a door, and each door had been propped open by a massive wedge of cement or some other debris. The doors were shockingly heavy, so we assumed that roving graffiti artists and vandals had opted for easier floor access by propping these doors open with these cement blocks. Granted, it seemed odd, but we didn't really think much about it until we were on the 7th floor and found yet another one of them. I was in one of the old bathrooms, giving a shot of some curtain or something like that, while Luke stood in the doorway. Suddenly, a massive boom sounded from the stairwell. We had the stairwell that we had just came from, causing Luke and I to jolt upright. It sounded like it just came from below us, like someone had suddenly slammed one of the doors. The problem was that none of the floors could have had a door slam, at least not on their own. Not only were they separated from the doorframe by a massive chunk of debris, but they were far too heavy to have been caught in the wind. The only door that could have slammed was if someone stood back, held it fully open, and then let it go. Not a behavior that anyone would normally engage in without purpose. After a few seconds of staring at each other with white saucer eyes, we decided that it was time to get the hell out of there. This meant finding another way down, as our previous way was currently occupied by someone or someones. There was little green arrows spray painted all over the building, and on a gut decision, we decided to try to follow them. Perhaps they were a lead to an exit of some sort, or maybe they were just some art. I don't know what possessed us to actually do this. The ones on the floor had the word exit written on them and above them. So I felt we had a good feeling about this. It wasn't until we had been following the arrows for 5 minutes that we realized that wherever they were taking us wasn't out of the building. In our fear and desire to leave as quickly as possible, we had neglected to realize that the arrows were taking us deeper to the center of the building. Windows are becoming less frequent, everything was getting darker, and there was even a weird damp feeling that the building started to develop. That was the weirdest part, how damp everything was. We had gone from a destroyed but dry building into an area that was so wet and rife with mold that walls and floors were growing greenish brown. And it had this awful stench too. We never found out what was at the end of that path, or where it was leading, or pushing us to. After turning back, we found an emergency exit door at the end of the hallway and we were able to climb out and escape from. We never saw anyone, but we were unsure if they saw us. The hospital was mostly windows, which means that literally anyone who would have been looking out a window would have been able to see us coming and going. I'm glad we didn't go further into the dark, wet areas. Who knows what would have been awaiting for us? But it surely wouldn't have been anything good. The door, the spray-painted directions, it all seemed too sinister, too intentional to be anything like a innocent vandal's prank. The entire time we were following the arrows, something just felt off. The hair was standing up on the back of my neck, and quite frankly, I was terrified. And despite being, again, a 22-year-old stocky male with a beard, I felt genuine fear down there. So whoever decided to stalk us and try to trap us in that abandoned, godforsaken hospital, let's not meet again.
Let me preface this encounter with a bit of background. You see, I'm in my mid-20s, but due to my father's work, I've been all over the globe. In the space of 11 years, from 8-ish to 19, I lived for varying amounts of time in 5 different countries while visiting 6 or 7 more. All of this not including my home country and very short holidays. This, coupled with my bipolar disorder and functioning insomnia, had made me keep a meticulous journal from the moment I could write, and later type. It has also given me a truckload of experiences that makes me feel very lucky. But of course, for all the good there are of course some bad ones mixed in. For the past 10 months or so, I've worked as a night porter in a pretty well-known hotel in a medium-sized city in the UK. This place has been around for decades and is immensely popular for its funeral teas and wakes, as morbid as that is. This is because it is across the road from one of the larger local cemeteries, about 1 kilometer from one of the larger churches, and to top it off, less than 3 kilometers from the crematorium, perfectly situated for the mourner's business. So a couple of weeks ago, I was almost finished my shift when the sweet old guy that is the cemetery's groundskeeper came in on the verge of tears. I'll call him Jacob, and he literally is the definition of an adorable, kind old man. He volunteered to work there, even when he is retired, because that's how nice he is. Anyways, Jacob came in around 7:50-ish, and I was waiting for the morning shift folks to turn up so I could go home. He started blabbering incoherently as emotional people tend to do, so I told him to calm down and asked if he wanted a cup of tea. 5 minutes later, he was sat down telling me what's wrong. Apparently, some idiots had jumped the fence and overturned a bunch of headstones, spray-painted vile crap on them, and even partially dug into some graves. By the time he had calmed down, I said my shift was finished and told him I'd help get the stones upright. Roll on a couple of hours and all of the stones were back in order and I went home shattered, but happy to have helped. I told my work that I'd probably be a little bit late, and they understood. Anyways, I got to my shift a couple hours late, and it turned out that I was going to be working on my own, because 2 of my colleagues' second job needed them. 2 a.m. comes and goes. Everything was in order, and I was adding some finishing touches to a large funeral tea in one of our function suites when I hear a knocking noise. At first I thought it was someone in the rooms upstairs walking the halls and I just dismissed it, but the knocking happened again, this time louder. 3rd time's the charm, and I found the source. One of the fire exits next to the function suite, but more specifically the fire exit directly across from the cemetery. Obviously I wasn't going to open the door, and I couldn't even if I wanted to, as they were all alarmed at night. But that didn't matter, because the knocking stopped. Not for too long, however. The knocking started again from another fire exit close to the car park and front exit. It was much louder now, so I knew exactly where it was straight away. And then again, it stopped. So in a bit of minor panic, I sprinted my way towards the front door and made sure it was locked. Then I grabbed the night porter's friend from behind reception, a walking stick that was basically a weapon. I could see my visitor's silhouette in the car park, walking slowly towards the entrance. It was definitely a man, at least a foot taller and a little bit broader than myself. He was wearing one of those long trench coats. He stopped just outside the light of the front entrance, but he was obviously staring right at me, and I could faintly make out his creepy, shit-eating smile. Then, he started taking something from behind his back. I braced myself, thinking what he had in his hands looked like a very large brick or something, so I thought he would smash the front door. But no, he did something far stranger. He just placed the brick thing on the ground, slowly at his feet. Then, with a weirdly happy demeanor, he waved and flashed another toothy, predatory grin at me before backing off into the darkness, towards the cemetery side entrance. Needless to say, I waited and checked the cameras around the buildings before venturing out to see what he had left me. It ended up being one of those small headstone markers, with the words, "You forgot this one," sprayed over it in bright green paint. To make this scenario creepier, the stone was for a baby's grave. So I locked up again and phoned the police. A couple of hours later, and a lot of footage from the CCTV scanned, the police left with a fuzzy frame shot of him that was basically a shape of dark on dark and nothing else to go by. So, to the midnight trench coat wearing grave robber, let's not meet again.
I grew up on the outskirts of a small southern town, and as such, I spent most of my days of summer vacations prowling the woods close to my home. About a half-hour walk from my house, down dirt roads and overgrown deer trails, there was a sandy stretch of beach along a creek. Since it was so far removed from civilization, and I had never seen another soul out there, I would often strip down naked and swim in the water to cool down under the summer sun. When I was a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, I had gone down to my secret beach to go skinny dipping. I had spent all morning there, watching herons and splashing in the water happily. Suddenly, I began to hear the sounds of something large forcing its way through the undergrowth upstream a ways. I was frozen, standing naked in the middle of the creek as 2 men emerged from the woods. They were much older than me, probably in their 30s. Something about the way they were dressed scared me. Anyone who's spent a lot of time in the woods knows the danger of thorn vines and brambles, but these guys were dressed in flip-flops, cargo shorts, and wife beaters. They were filthy and covered in scratches across their arms and legs, looking as if hiking through the woods hadn't ever been on their agenda. I had left my clothes in an untidy pile on the bank, but to grab them, I would have had to move much closer to the men. As I frantically tried to think of a way to get to my clothes without alerting these guys, one of them turned and locked eyes with me. I grew up around Southern manners. Seeing as I was a naked little girl trying to cover myself with my hands as I stood in the middle of a creek, I would have expected him to avert his gaze. But all he did was elbow his buddy in the ribs, point at me, and whisper something beyond my hearing. When they both turned and began to advance towards me, malicious grins on their faces, I officially lost my shit. Luckily, years of spending all my free time in the woods paid off. Forgetting modesty, I turned and ran at breakneck speed for the closest downstream deep channel. As I dove into the water, I could hear the men yelling and splashing behind me, trying desperately to catch up. I had always been at home in the water, and at this moment I swam as though my life depended on it, which it very well might have. I knew exactly where I needed to go. Earlier that summer, I had discovered what I thought of as my secret hiding spot. The banks were rocky and sheer on both sides of the creek here, around the bend and downstream from the sandy beach. I had been watching muskrats swimming in the water and had seen one swim through hanging kudzu vines into what I thought was solid stone. upon pulling back the vines and scaring the shit out of the muskrat in the process, I found an open space under an overhang of rock. I had always loved hiding and was immediately smitten with such a perfectly camouflaged spot. But weeks later, in this moment, I thought of it as my best hope. As I came close to my hiding spot, I ducked down and swam underwater to my hole in the stone. I only surfaced once I was safely behind my curtain of kudzu vines. I waited there for several minutes, trying to silence my heavy breathing and slow my rampaging heartbeat, until I heard the sounds of heavy crashing through the underbrush. I screamed a little, but thankfully had clamped a hand over my mouth in time to muffle it. As the sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves got closer, I could hear the men panting and cursing under their breath. It sounded as if they were walking on the edge of the bank a few feet above me. After they had moved down a ways, I heard a thud on the ground and an angry yell, as if one of the men had tripped and fallen. Another voice shushed him and said something that made me tremble. "Shut up, she'll hear you." I had never been more terrified than at that moment. I cried silently, pressing my back against the rock and praying they wouldn't find me. Even after I heard their footsteps continuing down the bank and into silence, I remained hidden behind the kudzu. I stayed there, delirious with fear and shivering in the water, until the sun had begun to dip low in the sky. I finally began to make my way back to get my clothes and go home, picking my way along deer trails that would let me move as silently as possible. When I had gotten close to the beach, I stayed hidden in the undergrowth and watched for several minutes to make sure those two slime balls weren't anywhere around. Thankfully, although I found several footprints circling my clothes and pacing along the bank, the guys were nowhere to be seen. My shirt and jeans were still there, luckily, but my panties were gone. I threw my clothes on and I ran the whole way home. I never told my mother about what happened at the creek, because I knew she would ban me from ever going into the woods again. I never saw those two guys after that, nor did I ever see anyone else down at that stretch of the beach. But needless to say, I never went skinny dipping again.
I'm Not Here to Hurt You by Alk Abi. My mom had been a drug addict her entire life. When I was younger, she constantly had people coming and going, and it seemed like the majority of the time, these people were really shady fuckers. What did I expect? I thought I'd share this experience that still bothers me quite a bit. I was about 12 years old at the time. I was sitting on the couch watching Drake and Josh. I think it was Drake and Josh, when there came a knock at the door. My mom wasn't home at the time, so I decided to turn off the TV and remain quiet. "Hello, Lise? You home?" It was a man. I want to drop something off, Elise. I stayed quiet. "Alright, Eloise, open the goddamn door! I'm not gonna hurt you!" At this point, I was scared. Even as a 12-year-old, when someone says they're not going to hurt you, that generally means that they did something in the past that would prompt them to reassure someone that they're going to hurt them. I mean, right? Started rattling the handle. "I swear to God, I will break this damn door down. You've been ignoring my calls, my texts. You can't run from me." Begun pounding, kicking at the door. I ran to the bathroom because literally it's the only door with a lock, and I hid in the bathtub with the curtain drawn. I decided to take my bath gun. I had not yet outgrown when playing with toys during bath time, okay? And I put a little water in it with a little shampoo. That would at least hurt his eyes if I shot it at him in the right way. I heard what sounded like splitting wood, then footsteps in my living room. I heard him go from room to room, yelling, "Elise, you can't ignore me now, you bitch!" Finally, he came into the bathroom door and tried to handle. "Oh, so you're in here." More pounding. He kicked the door and then stood still for a few moments before ripping open the curtain and peering down at me. He slicked his hand back into his hair. He had piercing green eyes and a sad attempt at facial hair. A black hooded sweatshirt, black jeans, black shoes. He held a brown bag in one of his tattoo-covered hands. Even better. I've seen you around before. You're Elise's daughter. So sweet. So sweet. It made my fucking skin crawl. He walked over to the window and locked it before squatting next to me. "Gonna come with me. How about that? I'll buy you some ice cream." I glared at him, trying my best not to look terrified. "Not much of a talker? Your mother could learn something from you." He reached his hand and rested it on my shoulder, and in one quick motion, I pulled my squirt gun from under my leg and I began spraying at his face. He didn't register at first, but he quickly began wiping his eyes. What the fuck is this? Ah, what the fuck? I hurled my body at him, causing him to fall back on his head on the toilet. I grabbed the brown paper bag and ran away from the bathroom, out into the hallway, and down the stairs. I caught my mom at the entrance steps, and I pulled her the other direction. "What's going on? You're making me drop my things." I remembered a head of lettuce rolling away. "Be free, my lettuce friend." She quickly caught on that something was terribly wrong and ran with me to my aunt's house. After catching my breath, I described the man and what he did. She quickly recognized the man as a guy named Tony, whom she owed a lot of money to. I realized that I was still holding a brown paper bag, that the man had I gave it to my mom, and it became quickly clear that there was a gun inside. He could have shown up to kill my mother, or kidnap her, or something like that. Only thing I know is that weird, creepy man, Tony the drug dealer. Let's not meet again.
At the time this occurred, I was in nursing school and struggling to get by. My dad had killed himself when I was little, and my mom turned to alcohol after that, so I didn't get much help there. But I was determined to get my degree and have a stable life for myself. I lived in a crappy ghetto apartment in the scary part of town. I'm talking gunshots at least once a week, needles on the sidewalk kinda scary. The random hours required for clinicals made it hard to hold down a good job. Plus I didn't have any transportation besides my bike, which was on its last leg. Long story short, I was having a very hard time and looking for any way to make some money. That's where Jane came in. She was a good friend of mine who I had known since freshman year. She understood my situation and told me how she was making $200 a night at a local strip club. This got my attention as that was a lot of money to me. She said the club had a no touching policy and guys literally threw money at you. So I made the decision to go with her that night and check it out. I was graduating in less than a year anyways, why not? Jane stayed by my side the entire night, and I felt safe. No one touched me, no one harassed me, and I made over $300. I was ecstatic. The best part is that I was able to choose my own hours, so I could make sure work didn't interfere with school. We went a few more times together before she left to visit her family for spring break. She left me explicit instructions that if I decided to go to work, I was to take a cab, call her when I left for work, call her when I got there, text her every hour, and call her when I was leaving. This seemed like overkill to me, but I agreed. I finished all my classwork early one night, and I thought, since it was spring break in a big city, I could probably earn a few hundred extra. I called a cab, called Jane, and went to work. Everything was normal. I was doing great and earning more than I ever had. Then, I was approached by a girl who I had seen there before. She introduced herself as Asia, but none of us went by our real names. She talked to me for a bit and asked me where I lived. This kinda sent off tiny alarm bells, but I figured she was just being friendly and named off another shitty apartment complex near mine. She told me she was looking for a chill roommate and asked if I would be interested. I was obviously taken aback, but I was dying to get out of my scary place. I asked how much rent was, and she said the guy who owned the duplex wasn't charging students that much as long as they were working. This should have sent off more alarms, since I didn't tell Asia I was a student, but I completely missed that at the time. I was a little cautious, but definitely interested. She told me she would take me by the place when the club closed so I could see it, and then take me home. To be honest, I thought there was no harm in looking. I called Jane and told her about the situation. She became very quiet and asked what the girl's name was. I told her, and she responded saying that I needed to call a cab and get back home now. I was honestly pissed that she was ruining this for me, until she explained that Asia was a known prostitute. Long story short, yeah, I would have gotten to live there, but as a sex slave. She didn't want me as her roommate, she wanted to bring me back to her pimp. I called a cab and hid in the back until it got there. I heard Asia looking for me, but I didn't come out. As soon as I got the text that the cab was there, I ran out to the back door and sprinted into it. I looked back to see that the commotion had caused Asia and a large man to turn in that direction. I never worked there again, and I graduated a few months later. I now live in a reasonably good apartment with a great job at the ER, but I still shudder to think what could have happened that night.
The Black Car by Mr.Nightmare, PhD. This is my second story I've posted here about a small town I went to in college. I found it a little bit funny since I'd had several stories for this particular sub, but I really do love this town. It's beautiful and one of my favorite places. Anyways, this happened about 3 years ago. I was attending university in a nice small town in California. I lived just a couple of blocks away from campus. It was about a 10-minute walk, so I never really bothered trying to find a parking place. I just walked. I had a math class that ran from 6 to 9 at night on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I generally had no issues walking home, even in the dark. I'm 6'3", around 200 pounds, I have a big red beard, and I believe people are usually more afraid of me than I am of them. I should also note that I'm a total pansy. If anyone were ever to attack me, I'd probably go into the fetal position and start crying. About a week before this particular night, the school sent out an email to all the students. There had been several instances of girls being stalked, and in a couple cases, attacked or taken by a group of 3 to 4 men in a black car with 4 doors. They warned us to walk in groups and not to stay out late. The attacks were all after dark. I remember reading the email and feeling horrible for the girls who had already been attacked before this was sent out. But I didn't pay much attention to it, or really any mind. I don't really fit the attacker's criteria, unless if one of them happened to be homosexual. Well, people had been able to count the number of assailants and describe the car. Nobody's ever been able to get a license plate number, and with the fallibility of memory, it's quite possible that even if they did, it would be wrong. It was a very cold Thursday night. I'd worn my large hooded jacket to keep warm on my walk home. We had a test that day, which meant that we were going to leave class early. Our teacher would usually spend 20 or so minutes going over stuff, then give us a test. So after we finished and turned it in, we were allowed to leave. So instead of all 30 or so of us leaving class at once, we were spread out in our departures. I was probably the 10th or so person to finish that test, and I started my walk back home. I threw on my big jacket and put my hood up. I loved this jacket because it was incredibly warm and made me kind of look like a bear. One of the people who finished the test before me, thus a fairly petite girl, had sat next to each other several times. I'm pretty socially awkward, and I'd never really spoken to her. She was about 30 yards ahead of me. It was around 8 p.m., and it was dark out. She was staring at her phone as she walked along. We'd been walking for a couple of minutes when I started noticing something that made me feel a bit off. There weren't any street lights along the stretch of road for some reason, so it was pretty dark, but I could have sworn that there was something moving in the street. But I wasn't really too sure to really act on anything. I began to pay closer and closer attention, and after a few seconds I realized there was a car moving slowly behind this girl. It was a black car, and they didn't have the lights on, so it was almost impossible to see them. I immediately recalled the email I'd received the previous week about the attackers. Small girl, alone at night, black car, holy shit. I sped up to start trying to catch up with her. The car pulled closer as well. I called out to the girl, and she stopped, turned around, and looked at me. As she turned, the car doors opened, and I grabbed my phone, turned the flashlight app on, and the 3 men jumped out of the car and started running at her. I started yelling at them, and they started running away from me. They were about to catch her, and I was sprinting at them. I'm 100% sure that 3 dudes would absolutely be able to kick my ass. I sure one dude would be able to kick my ass. I had no idea what was going to happen if I caught up to them in time. I just started shouting everything I could think of at them as I tried to deepen my voice to sound more intimidating. I puffed up my bear jacket as big as I could, and I remembered that nobody had been able to get the plate number, so I shined my light on the car and started shouting out the license plate number info at them. This freaked out one of the attackers. 2 of them ran back to the car. One guy turned to me and looked like he was going to come at me. But one of the guys in the car told him not to. I was too big. They flipped their lights on, and they sped off. I reached out to the girl to make sure she was okay, and I shined my light at her to make sure she had been cut or attacked by one of the men. She was shaking and crying, and at this point, I could hear other people had finished their test and seen the last encounter. Another guy from class and I walked the girl to her dorm, and she even made us walk her to her door on the 3rd floor, even though access to the building required a card. I called the police and told them about the encounter. I had memorized the plates on the car, and I had shouted at those guys a couple of times. A month later, they found a car. Inside, there were some knives, duct tape, mace, and rope. They caught 2 of the guys outright, and were trying to get them to tell who the other dude involved was. Every Tuesday and Thursday, even after the police caught those guys, I would walk that girl home to her dorm. After class, I would then head home. It was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I thought for a while that I was either going to watch this girl be kidnapped or be brutally murdered stopping it. Stupid rapey, kidnappy, murder, kidnapper, guys. Let's not meet again.